Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion of knowledge here, and as we saw, Descartes really kind of started everybody on this skepticism path again, but you know, really around that time, there were other people who didn't agree with Descartes. There were the empiricists like John Locke, who rejected this strict view about knowledge, and he and the other people who ended up being called empiricists decided that, look, really, knowledge begins with perception and sensation. That's where we get a lot of our information, probably most of our information, really. But he broke it down. John Locke, anyway, broke it down into three kinds of knowledge. He had this idea that we had intuitive knowledge, and that was things that we know just by the meanings of the words. So if we understand what a square is, we know that it's not a circle. So the proposition a square is not a circle is known pretty much just intuitively, right? Then there's demonstrative knowledge, which in some ways can come from intuitive knowledge depending on what it is. Something like the Pythagorean theorem can come out of our knowledge of what a triangle is. We can say that if we understand that a triangle, the angles, have these certain properties that they have to have in order for it to be a triangle, we can figure out what the Pythagorean theorem is. And then sort of separately, there is the sensitive knowledge, which is known through our perceptions. So we can say that we know that there's a cat on the mat because we perceive that cat. So it's fairly simple there, and we know what a cat is. Maybe that perhaps is intuitive knowledge. Maybe that's learned by sensations as well. So he was really interested in things like justice and, kind of like Plato. But he thought that we come to our ideas of justice and things like that through our perceptual observations of the world. So we go out and we see what people do and what works, what doesn't, what makes goodness for humans and what doesn't, and then we form an idea of justice. So the idea is that we go out there and experience the world, and then that's how we get a lot of our knowledge that's not perhaps just intuitive knowledge. And these kinds of knowledge, for him, of course, can be combined, as we already kind of saw with the whole idea of the Pythagorean theorem. Anyway, then there was David Hume, who had a different kind of skepticism than Descartes. Instead of questioning so much our perceptions in general, he doubted things like our assumptions about cause and effect. So he said that, look, we might think that us dropping something causes it to fall, but do we really know that? We can observe that when we drop something it falls, but we don't really have a lot of evidence, according to him, about what the cause of that, what the cause and effect might be. We can have correlation ideas, but to extrapolate cause and effect from those, he thought was perhaps going too far. So he had a different kind of skepticism. In the same kind of way, he questions our assumptions that a self endures over time, because he says, look, if you look inside yourself, all you're really going to see is yourself thinking about stuff. You're not going to see a, quote, self. And we'll get to that perhaps a bit later. But he also challenged arguments for the existence of God and claims of religious miracles, because he thought that he was very conservative in a sense about what knowledge is and what we should believe. And he thought that religious miracles went too far outside of our normal experience for us to accept them. So on the other hand, though, he didn't believe in global skepticism, so he didn't really think that we should doubt everything. He thought that was kind of a bit much, and that we really couldn't live that way. So he was more judicious about what to doubt, perhaps, than something like the evil demon of Descartes, that Descartes may be suggesting with the idea of the evil demon. So when we get into the 20th century views of knowledge, we kind of end up going backwards a bit to Plato, as we said earlier, who thought that knowledge is really something like justified true belief. So What is truth, you might ask? In this case, usually philosophers are talking about something like propositional truth. So a proposition is true if it corresponds to the way the world is. You can think of a proposition as the content of a sentence, just for simplicity's sake. So a proposition that is snowing, can be expressed by the sentence "it is snowing," or by the sentence that in a different language, right? So you could express it in a different language, you could express it in sign language, but the proposition, the content of that sentence is going to be the same. So if it's really Tuesday, then according to the correspondence theory of truth, the sentence or the content of the sentence "it is Tuesday" is true. So we'll just take that version of truth for now and say that this is the classical analysis of knowledge that most 20th century philosophers adhere to, at least till the next slide. So S, who is a person, knows that P, a proposition, if and only if the proposition is true, the person believes that P, and the person is justified in believing that P. And then we get into what justification means, and that causes a whole lot of problems. And even if we could solve that problem, the problem of justification, Gettier published a paper that made everybody rethink this whole idea of justified true belief, which seems kind of reasonable, right? If you want to talk about knowledge, it makes sense to say that somebody has to know it, that it has to be true, and that they have to be some kind of way justified. But then Gettier said, well, Gettier didn't use this example, but this is an example that people use and call a Gettier example because it's a little bit simpler than the example that Gettier used. So, suppose somebody walks by a stopped clock that reads 12 p.m., and the person forms a correct belief that it is in fact 12 p.m. Then their belief is justified, right? It's justified because normally we would say that it's reasonable to form a belief on looking at about the time by looking at a clock. Okay, so their belief is justified, and it's also true, right? Because it was 12 p.m. when they walked by the clock. Clock says 12 p.m. But suppose that the clock was actually stopped at 12 p.m. and they just happen to walk by at that moment when it was 12 p.m. Do they know that it's 12 p.m.? And it seems like the problem is that they could have easily been wrong. If they had walked by at 12:01, they would have formed a false belief, right? Because they would have looked at the clock, it would have still said 12, but it would actually be 12:01. So it seems to be just chance that they walked by at 12 p.m. when the clock happened to be correct. Does that mean, since they have justified true belief, but don't seem to have knowledge, does that mean that there's something missing in our account of knowledge as justified true belief? You can say, well, okay, he had a false belief, right? He falsely believed that the clock was working. But then we start asking, okay, is one false belief enough to stop a person from actually having knowledge? And an example is a detective who thinks that all 12 witnesses are telling the truth about who committed a crime, when in fact one is lying. Does the false belief the detective has that all 12 witnesses are telling the truth mean that the detective does not know who committed the crime? And it seems like we don't want to say that, right? Just because we always have some false beliefs. We're never going to be perfect. And you might want to say, well, it seems like the detective isn't essentially relying on this one lie in the witness's testimony. However, it turns out to be really hard to explain what essentially relying on a belief means. You can try to come up with examples, and it's pretty easy to come up with examples where there are false beliefs involved that may be essentially relied on or may not be, and people have tried to sort of tweak this whole theory and come up with a way to say, well, can be, you can have a false belief that you're not relying on, or that you are relying on, and we can somehow tell the difference. It turns out to actually be pretty difficult. So we'll see next time where we can go with this idea and whether we can fix it.